This is called the Metaphysics of Michael Faraday. Oh gosh, it's hard to see you. You might think this is the first talk at this conference to address metaphysics, but it's actually only the latest one. The Metaphysics of Michael Faraday. This talk began as a reflection on what drove Michael Faraday to metaphysics in a paper called A Speculation Touching Electric Conduction and the Nature of Matter. Faraday is famous amongst us and the academic world as a great experimentalist. He was perhaps the last of the natural philosophers to be suspicious of the role of mathematics in the study of nature. I am led to wonder about the role that metaphysics may play in the electric universe. While I'm afraid this talk will be largely disconstructive, I do expect to propose some safety rules for venturing out into the metaphysical sea. And I promise you an all-powerful aphorism, which you may carry off with you. It is not as elegant as anything by Heraclitus, but I think you shall find it highly consequential. Now, this word metaphysics, it has an unusual origin. It was the title of a book by Aristotle, but he didn't give this book the title. Indeed, he didn't even make a book. It's a collection of lecture notes, possibly. And what it means is that title that was assigned by sort of editors, ta meta ta pusika. What it means is the bits that come after the physics. That's it. I mean, it's the publisher's title. What do you call this stuff, right? But there's a reason why metaphysics is really a good name for that set of lectures. What I would suggest is that it's about the things that are presupposed by the physics or by physics. That is, the necessary assumptions that make the phenomena possible. I like to think of it this way. What must be going on behind the scenes in order for the show to go on? Aristotle catalogues the ideas of his predecessors, people who are often called pre-Socratics. Now, here are two examples. This is Empedocles. Al agemuton cluti, mater gartoi prenas auxe, Oscar kai pridewe papi pauskon perata muton diplereo tote mengaren auxeta mononenai ec pleonon tote audie pu pleon ex henosenai pur kai hudor kai gaia kai veros hapleton hypsos ne costo lomenon dicaton atalanton hapante kai pilotas entoisin lisa ma coste platoste. But come, hear my disclosures, for learning expands your mind. Seeing as I earlier spoken already displayed the full extent of my thoughts, I shall speak a duality. Sometimes one thing alone waxes into being out of many things, but at others many things grow into being out of one. Fire and water and earth and air, limitless on high, and strife, the destroyer, divided from these. A counterweight in all directions, along with love right in amongst them, his match in length and breadth. Now, these hexameters are worthy of Homer, in my humble or not so humble opinion. The poetry is not the jam spread on the whole wheat toast. The appeal of physics, mathematics, and science generally is not different from the pull we feel in the measures of verse and music. Elegance, the standard in theory and proof, is first of all surely an aesthetic idea. For good or ill, I think it was aesthetic judgments that led to the pitfalls of 20th century mathematical physics. How did Empedocles come to these insights? We know nothing of his empirical experience or tradition. The four states of matter, fire, water, earth, and air, are plasma, liquid, solid, and gas. Around these and in amongst them are strife, that is repulsion, and love, that is attraction. Empedocles is describing the plasma universe. This is a thing that Heraclitus said, panta re. If you can believe it or not, it's two words, and in my life I've spent many, many hours discussing these two words as a student and also as a teacher. Everything flows, right? Doesn't sound like saying anything amazing, but it's a paradox. Everything is the whole of things, all of things. It is. Everything is. That's what you can say about everything. You can't say everything flows, right? On the other hand, some students would say he should have said just re, because re, the verb there, in Greek doesn't require a subject. So it could mean it flows or it's flowing. We have a saying like that, we have phrases like that in English, like it's raining. I think you'd be hard put to answer the question, what is the subject of that sentence? It's raining. Now, the physics is about motion in the world. Aristotle's argument climaxes with the necessity of a real, unmoved, or prime mover, where the pre-Socratics often seem to posit haphazard principles of becoming. Aristotle argued in a number of ways for the necessity of a being that itself unmoved caused the motion we observe, both in beings like ourselves, who are moved movers, as well as the inanimate things that are simply moved. Those moderns who grow up amid the dogma of the laws of nature or physical laws would prefer at most a prime mover in a temporal sense, that is, an initiator, not an imminent ever-presence. We cannot have someone backstage, in other words, changing the rules so that Hamlet can marry Ophelia. In the Metaphysics, he elaborates on this unmoved mover's nature as a living God. In a passage that sometimes embarrasses Aristotelians, metaphysicians distinguish themselves from religious people, I find. Then, if it's all hunky-dory in this way, that the way we are, sometimes, God is always wonderful. But he is even more than this, more wonderful still. And that is, in fact, the way it is. Life, at any rate, also belongs to him. For the activity of thought is life, and he is that activity. His activity in its very self is life, the very best and eternal. We declare that God is a living thing, eternal and the very best, so that life and a lifespan continuous and eternal belongs to God, for this is what God is. Now, you may be surprised to know that at the end of Sir Isaac Newton's Principia, the author goes even further in this direction. The Principia Mathematica concludes with pages and pages about God. Now, this is Newton, right? From his true dominion, it follows that true God is a living, intelligent, and powerful being, and from his other perfections that he is supreme or most perfect. He is not eternity or infinity, but eternal and infinite. He is not duration or space, but he endures and is present. He endures forever and is everywhere present, and by existing always and everywhere, he constitutes duration and space. And this is just the merest excerpt. It goes on. I want to call attention to duration and space. These are the two elements that are the template, the kind of stage upon which Newton's physics works, operates. And I'm not sure exactly if there's a contradiction here. He says God is not duration or space, but also in the same breath he says he constitutes duration and space. And then goes on, right, to blind metaphysical necessity and so on and so on. At the end of it, he says, and thus much concerning God, to discourse of whom from the appearance of things does certainly belong to natural philosophy. That was the first point at which I thought perhaps he's protesting too much. And there's a way in which he sort of understood what a Newtonian might be like. And he's kind of being reassuring that, this is all about God still. But truth is stranger than fiction. Most of Newton's works have not been published. They're only just now being worked on. The Principia was a kind of hobby that he was encouraged by Edmund Halley to publish. Most of his work is about a sort of Kabbalistic work, trying to figure out when the comet's going to come back. That's Isaac Newton. Right. Now, I'm going on in the same general scholium of Book 3, the last book of Newton's Principia. Hitherto we've explained the phenomena of the heavens and of our sea by the power of gravity, but have not yet assigned the cause of this power. This is certain that it must proceed from a cause that penetrates to the very centers of the suns and planets without suffering the least diminution of its force, that operates not according to the quantity of the surfaces of the particles upon which it acts, as mechanical causes do, but according to the quantity of the solid matter which they contain, and propagates its virtue on all sides to immense distances. I call attention to the quantity of the solid matter. But hitherto I have not been able to discover the cause of those properties of gravity from phenomena, and I frame no hypotheses. For whatever is not deduced from the phenomena is to be called an hypothesis, and hypotheses, whether metaphysical or physical, whether of occult qualities or mechanical, have no place in experimental philosophy. In this philosophy, particular propositions are inferred from the phenomena and afterwards rendered general by induction. Thus it was that the impenetrability, the mobility, and the impulsive force of bodies and the laws of motion and of gravitation were discovered. And to us, it is enough that gravity does really exist and act according to the laws which we have explained, and abundantly serves to account for all the motions of the celestial bodies and of our sea. Now, that's not where the Principia ends. There's one more paragraph. Notice, though, that we have already covered the motions of the celestial bodies and the tides. Okay, that's all done and dusted. And now we might add something concerning a most subtle spirit. It's the very last paragraph of Newton's Principia. A subtle spirit which pervades and lies hid in all gross bodies, by the force and action of which spirit the particles of bodies mutually attract one another at near distances and cohere if contiguous, and electric bodies operate to greater distances, as well repelling as attracting to the neighboring corpuscles. And light is emitted, reflected, refracted, inflected, and heats bodies. And all sensations excited and the members of animal bodies move at the command of the will, namely by the vibrations of this spirit, mutually propagated along the solid filaments of the nerves, from the outward organs of sense to the brain, and from the brain to the muscles. But these are things that cannot be explained in few words, nor are we furnished with that sufficiency of experiments which is required to an accurate determination and demonstration of the laws by which this electric and elastic spirit operates. Pervades and lies hid in all gross bodies. The template set here seems not to have been recognized properly for its portentous effect on the future of physics. On the one hand, it sets the stage for the great investigators of electromagnetism in the 19th century. On the other, it makes their study the jam on the toast. Wittingly or unwittingly, the idea that this electric force, the subtle spirit not yet well known through experiment, might underlie the gravity that explains cosmology and the tides has been as subtly as a subtle spirit precluded. We've got that bit covered. Now, here's something for dessert. Of course, the 19th century natural philosophers went at this dessert with multiple spoons, but the menu had been set. The world ran on gravity. Electricity was a side dish. Right, so to the meat. Unhappily, I must excerpt from Faraday's paper, which I intended to read out to you in full. Bear with me, I'm just going to read to you. The view of the atomic constitution of matter considers the atom as a something material having a certain volume. These, though grouped and held together by their powers, do not touch each other, but have intervening space. Otherwise, pressure of cold could not make a body contract into a smaller bulk, nor heat nor tension make it larger. The word atom, which can never be used without involving much that is purely hypothetical, is often intended to be used to express a simple fact. But good as the intention is, I have not yet found a mind that did habitually separate it from its accompanying temptations. And there can be no doubt that the word's definite proportions, equivalents, primes, and so on, these are the chemical data from which atoms could at that time already be inferred, which did and do express fully all the facts of what is usually called the atomic theory in chemistry, were dismissed because they were not expressive enough and did not say all that was in the mind of him who used the word atom in their stead. They did not express the hypothesis as well as the fact. Light and electricity are two great and searching investigators of the molecular structure of bodies, and it was whilst considering the probable nature of conduction and insulation in bodies not decomposable by the electricity to which they were subject, and the relation of electricity to space contemplated as void of that by which the atomist is called matter, that considerations something like those which follow were presented to my mind. And what he's saying is if matter consists of atoms and space, he feels obliged to make the following observations and conclusions. I'm quoting again. Take the case of a piece of shellac, a non-conductor, and it would appear at once from such a view of its atomic constitution that space is an insulator. For if it were a conductor, the shellac could not insulate, whatever might be the relation as to the conducting power of its material atoms. The space would be like a fine metallic web penetrating it in every direction, just as we may imagine of a heap of siliceous sand having all its pores filled with water, or as we may consider of a stick of black wax, which, though it contains an infinity of particles of conducting charcoal diffused through every part of it, cannot conduct, because a non-conducting body of resin intervenes and separates them from one another, like the supposed space in the lac. Next, take the case of a metal, platinum or potassium, constituted according to the atomic theory in the same manner. The metal is a conductor, but how can this be, except space be a conductor? For it is the only continuous part of the metal, and the atoms not only do not touch by the theory, but as we shall see presently, must be assumed to be a considerable way apart. Space, therefore, must be a conductor, or else the metals could not conduct, but would be in the situation of the black sealing wax referred to a little while ago. It would seem, therefore, that in accepting the ordinary atomic theory, space may be proved to be a non-conductor in non-conducting bodies and a conductor in conducting bodies. But the reasoning ends in this: a subversion of that theory altogether. For if space be an insulator, it cannot exist in conducting bodies, and if it be a conductor, it cannot exist in insulating bodies. Any ground of reasoning which tends to such conclusions as these must in itself be false. Now, I was going to share with you some of his thought experiments. You can see from the chart itself, he's comparing numbers of atoms in equal volumes to their conducting power, and you see that there's no correlation. Now, someone is likely to say, this is me now, well, Faraday didn't know what we know about the atom. Specifically, he did not know about electrons that are free to move through space. But note that his picture applies to any center of force, not just the collective that we confusingly call an atom, but to the proton, neutron, and electron, and beyond that to any conceivable subtron. In each case, we have a thingy and the space around it that results in contact, bonding, and repulsion, and shows mass. Where, for example, does one locate the charge on an electron? If it is a little particle, does the charge reside on its nucleus or in the space around it, or both, or neither? Faraday. If we must assume it all as indeed in a branch of knowledge like the present, let me just show you this one. This is the usual sort of picture of atoms at that time, anyway, a nucleus and space. If we must assume it all as indeed in a branch of knowledge like the present, we can hardly help it, then the safest course appears to be to assume as little as possible. And in that respect, the atoms of Boscovich appear to me to have a great advantage. The Boscovich atoms are mere centers of force or powers, not particles of matter in which the powers themselves reside. If in the ordinary view of atoms, we call the particle of matter away from the powers A, and the system of powers or forces in and around it M, then in Boscovich's theory, A disappears, or is a mere mathematical point, whilst in the usual notion, it is a little unchangeable, impenetrable piece of matter, and M is an atmosphere of force grouped around it. How can we for a moment imagine that potassium's conducting property belongs to it any otherwise than a consequence of the properties of the space, or as I have called it above, the M? So also its other properties in regard to light or magnetism or solidity or hardness or specific gravity must belong to it in consequence of the properties or forces of the M, not those of the A, which, without the forces, is conceived of as having no powers. But then surely the M is the matter of the potassium. To my mind, therefore, the A or nucleus vanishes and the substance consists of the powers, or M. Hence, matter will be continuous throughout, and in considering a mass of it, we have not to suppose a distinction between its atoms and any intervening space. The powers around the centers give these centers the properties of atoms of matter. In such a view, all the contradiction resulting from the consideration of electric insulation and conduction disappears. The atoms may be conceived of as highly elastic. If an atom be conceived to be a center of power, that which is ordinarily referred to under the term shape would now be referred to the disposition and relative intensity of the forces. Now, to be sure, Faraday is doing plenty of assuming and speculating here. But there is a method to the metaphysics. In order for the phenomena to play out on the stage in the way we observe them to do, in this case, the insulating and conducting properties of different materials, what must be going on behind the scenes? Given that we have independent evidence from chemistry that matter is in measurable ways an atomic phenomenon, what properties do these invisible atoms need to have? We are all, in fact, quite used to dealing with this, and the activity is no less metaphysical for our being used to it, nor is it any less metaphysical for being highly pragmatic. We have a way of assuming, only what needs to be there to be consistent with the results. It's a sort of need-to-know basis. Let's just go with that, with what works. Right? You'll be familiar with the Bohr atom. It's very useful. It models valence, it allows you to picture quantum jumps, and so on. But it is a bit of orbital metaphysics that we know by independent means cannot reflect the reality. Yet it is all the same fit for purpose, and more than a little elegant. Less elegant, but equally fit for purpose, is this diagram from an EE textbook, courtesy of my wife's bookshelf. You've got your insulator, your semiconductor, and your conductor, your valence and conduction bands. This is a schematic fit for purpose, which, like all models, is purely metaphysical. So Faraday's reasoning and the Boscovich atom can take their place alongside these, if they also are fit for purpose. Here I let the great experimentalist finish his train of thought. As regards the mutual penetrability of matter, one would think that the facts respecting potassium and its compounds already described will be enough to prove that point to a mind which accepts a fact for a fact and is not obstructed in its judgment by preconceived notions. With respect to the penetrability of the atoms, it seems to me to present in many points of view a more beautiful, yet equally probable and philosophic idea of the constitution of bodies than the other hypotheses, especially in the case of chemical combination. If we suppose an atom of oxygen and an atom of potassium about to combine and produce potash, I guess it's potassium hydroxide. The hypothesis of solid, unchangeable, impenetrable atoms places these two particles side by side in a position easily because mechanically imagined and not unfrequently represented. Think of the Bohr atoms. But if these two atoms be centers of power, they will mutually penetrate to the very centers, thus forming one atom or molecule with powers either uniformly around it or arranged as the resultant of the powers of the two constituent forms. And the manner in which two or many centers of force may in this way combine, and afterwards under the dominion of stronger forces separate again, may in some degree be illustrated by the beautiful case of the conjunction of two sea waves of different velocities into one, their perfect union for a time, and final separation into the constituent waves. Yes, I say, Mr. Faraday, beautiful indeed. And that is not nothing when it comes to the persuasive power of natural philosophy. This beauty is not the jam on the toast. In his conclusion, he returns our own thought to that final paragraph of Newton's Principia. Again, this is Faraday. The view now stated of the constitution of matter would seem to involve necessarily the conclusion that matter fills all space, or at least all space to which gravitation extends, including the sun and its system. For gravitation is a property of matter dependent on a certain force, and it is this force which constitutes the matter. In that view, matter is not merely mutually penetrable, but each atom extends, so to say, throughout the whole of the solar system, yet always retaining its own center of force. This at first sight seems to fall in very harmoniously with Mossotti's mathematical investigations and reference of the phenomena of electricity, cohesion, gravitation, and so on to one force in matter. And also again with the old adage, matter cannot act where it is not. Now, I want you to note how definitively the tables have been turned on Newton. The subtle spirit has done much more than penetrate the impenetrable solidity of gravitating matter. It has exploded the stuff from within. Faraday's consideration of conduction, insulation, and other facts having to do with chemical reactions and volume have led to a view of the fact of gravity which is no longer compatible with the theory that its force is proportional to the density of matter. Faraday's own preferred metaphysical underpinning, the Boscovich atom, now conceived as a field of force whose center offers nothing more than a location, does not cohere with any simple notion of density. I believe there is nascent here a tenet of electric universe theory, to whose own required metaphysics we finally turn. And before I proceed, I feel it prudent to quote Michel de Montaigne from Unrepentance, Du Repentir. So while I may well by chance contradict myself, all the same, the truth, as Demadi said, I do not contradict. If my soul could find a footing, I would not be essaying, but I would be resolving. She's always in her apprenticeship and on trial. Montaigne is the man who invented the essay. He would probably not recognize it in the form in which it is now used to test and abuse students. The word means attempt. In what follows, there will be contradiction, but not of the truth. This is from Anthony Perrat's webpage. Plasma is so energetic or hot that in space it consists solely of ions and electrons. It is only when plasma is cooled that the atoms or molecules that are so predominant in forming gases, liquids, and solids that we are so accustomed to on Earth is possible. So in space, plasma remains electrically charged. Thus, plasmas carry electric currents and are more influenced by electromagnetic forces than by gravitational forces. Outside the Earth's atmosphere, the dominant form of matter is plasma, and empty space has been found to be quite alive with a constant flow of plasma. Right? Space plasma remains electrically charged. In space, plasma is hot. Right? But on the very same web page, he quotes, admittedly, a different authority, Professor Eastman. Plasma consists of a collection of free-moving electrons and ions, atoms that have lost electrons. Energy is needed to strip electrons from atoms to make plasma. The energy can be of various origins: thermal, electrical, or light, ultraviolet light, or intense visible light from a laser. With insufficient sustaining power, plasmas recombine into neutral gas. So, which is it? I mean, does plasma need energy to form, or is it everywhere in space, and is space hot? Now, this one actually I just put in for fun because it's fun, so you can read it for yourself. Now, my initial foray into the metaphysics of plasma involved the question, who or what is the cosmic generator? That is, looking for the source of the energy that that allows for the separation of charge. That is to say, who is the plasma prime mover? What is the plasma prime mover? I noted that the various machines used in plasma experiments have to be plugged in, right? So where is the cosmic plasma plugged in? But I now believe that there is no beginning to what we might call the plasma cycle, that is intrinsic to it as such. Charge separation or local charge imbalance will cause a spontaneous flow. When a double layer breaks down, a burst of charged material is sent elsewhere. A deficit is left behind, and so the conditions are set in each place for a new process. Have you noticed that a supernova never results in a death, but in a beautiful new plasma object? In point of fact, I would ask if there is ever such a thing as death in the cosmos, that is to say, the inertia of the purely and merely inert. So there is no intrinsically necessary beginning or ending to the motion of plasma, which is, of course, the motion of the universe. So we shall not multiply assumptions or frame hypotheses. Wait a minute, Dave, that's a perpetual motion machine you got there. Well, open a window. It's all moving, right? Nothing ever stops moving. A gust of wind and a cosmic jet are manifesting a single power. That's the world we're given. The objection to perpetual motion machines is one of those absurd capitalist parsimonies. It is no free lunch. It comes from a mindset, a metaphysics, that privileges neutrality, stability, equilibrium. But what the world gives us as facts are polarization, unstable equilibria, and explosions. This world is in perpetual motion. Everything flows. In other words, it is not like a machine. Consider the world of thermodynamics, which paints an entirely adequate picture of reality for its purposes, just as Bohr's atom and the engineer's valence diagram do for theirs. Perhaps you also grew up with this chestnut, the idea of heat death. The world is running down. Entropy, man. Just think how infantile that sort of metaphysical projection is. Both gravitational cosmology and thermodynamics apply otherwise useful assumptions in a universal way and then live with the various dark absurdities that have to follow when they are applied to experience and fact. So there is another warning to heed while on the metaphysical sea. Minimize your assumptions, but don't let that give you license to apply them too broadly. That more than defeats their purpose. For the second law of thermodynamics to apply to the universe, it must be conceived of as a finite system. Nothing observable requires or in any way confirms this assumption, and we just heard someone say it's a priori impossible. Only the Riemannian postulate about parallel lines could allow such a universe to be mathematized. Euclidean parallels travel in an infinite plane. As Lucretius points out, if the world is finite, what's to stop me from going to the edge and chucking a spear over the wall? But at a more fundamental level, the random motion by which we characterize the muddled phenomenon of heat is not based in the atoms that are supposed to be engaged in it. The atom, literally an individual, something that cannot further be divided, turns out to be more like the concept as it is used in psychology, sociology, and politics. Here, an individual is a kind of pluralist collective, divided within itself somehow between loci of force that are opposite in kind but long to be with each other, and yet are kept apart, perhaps by their own energy, perhaps by their desire or revulsion for other so-called individuals external to them, replete with their own tensions and proclivities. This is not cosmic harmony. This is not even yin and yang. This is a world of inner tension and external motion determined by predilection and revulsion. Individuals move in different directions because of either longing or loathing for other individuals. It is a world where choice, on any level that word makes sense to you, is fundamental. Therefore, this is not random motion. I think it fair to expect that the motions and counter-motions of plasma will cause a rethinking of the phenomena of temperature and heat in the sapphire experiments mimicking the sun and other stars, and in the theory of the Earth's climate. So what does the Thornhill universe require? Ralph Sainsbury's metaphysics suggests an underlying electrostatic polarity behind the scenes of the polarity that we see on stage, so that electrons and protons, for example, carry charge that is net negative or positive. There are some in my acquaintance who deny that there is such a thing as electrostatics. I'm just not going to go there. Here is the last of the helpful little pictures I have to offer. It was not made for purpose. It's adapted from Wikimedia Commons. And disregard the colors, except that the negative is purple. Sainsbury's views recall what Faraday said about Ottaviano Fabrizio Mossotti's mathematical investigations and reference of the phenomena of electricity, cohesion, gravitation, and so on, to one force in matter. Electrical gravitation is caused by the combined force of dipoles like these, but understand them not to be the pluralist collectives called atoms, but their dynamic citizens, called protons, electrons, and neutrons. We can even conceive of these squibs as neutrinos, with Wall's permission. If it is worth actually qualifying such picture thinking, recall that size and shape are not qualities actually given by the data. Its lesser mass, for example, does not necessarily make an electron smaller in relation to a proton. The attraction between aligned dipoles is said to diminish in subquadruplicate ratio, that's the old way of saying it, or the inverse of the fourth power of the distance. Across the surface, right, we square this and find the subduplicate or inverse square ratio that characterizes gravity. So what does the electric universe need to make a safe voyage across the wine dark sea to metaphysical Colchis and the golden fleece? Exactly what the phenomena require. In the case of electric gravity, instantaneous action at a distance, and resonance. The collective dipole force must act like a rope. This was, in fact, Newton's analogy, an invisible cord tied between Earth and Moon, whose tension could be shown to be caused by the same force that swung a pendulum and raised and lowered the tides. According to Wall, gravity would be felt as a longitudinal force. I compare this to a tug on the rope, whereas light would be like a transverse wave through a rope or water, shaken or splashed at the source. Resonance is something I best understand through music. It is a fact, not an assumption. It requires some kind of medium of transmission, the air in the case of sound, that is capable of translating the vibration to a concordantly tuned string. Faraday mentioned a theory about the spin of magnetic atoms. Sainsbury speaks of magnetic materials such as bar magnets that defy gravity being able to maintain a dipolar alignment different from the one produced by merely ponderous bodies in their presence. This could mean an axial alignment of spin orbits. The resonant spin of newly collectivized matter may be the cause of high redshift in the spectra of quasars. But we only need the one schematic picture to illustrate the difficulties, whether we think we're looking at subtrons, subatomic particles, atoms, or a medium, say a medium of polarizable neutrinos. The tension in the gravitational rope or the sympathetic resonance of related individuals, however close or far away on any scale you choose, requires contact. If the medium of transmission for light is polarizable neutrinos, we need a medium for the medium. Because the one thing that cannot happen in this image is contact. Contact neutralizes charge, but media are media of contact. So what is the capable stuff that carries the transmission through the transmitters? I take some refuge again in the final paragraph of Faraday's paper, where he spoke of the continuity and extent of matter, and the idea that matter cannot act where it is not. But I admit to taking small comfort, because the difficulties of combining polarity with resonance can seem, to me at least, to be intractable. I hope I'll hear from others about this. I contradict myself, but never the truth. Montaigne's should remain a maxim for electric universe theory. I did warn that this talk would be disconstructive. Faraday concludes, my desire has been rather, well, it's no part of my intention to enter into such considerations as these, or what the bearings of this hypothesis would be on the theory of light and the supposed ether. My desire has been rather to bring certain facts from electrical conduction and chemical combination to bear strongly upon our views regarding the nature of atoms and matter, and so to assist in distinguishing natural philosophy, our real knowledge, that is, the knowledge of facts and laws, from that which, though it has the form of knowledge, may, from its including so much that is mere assumption, be the very reverse. Faraday well illustrates a Delphic adage that ought to apply as our final rule for the bits that come after the physics. Mad in agan, nothing too much. Now, I did promise you an aphorism. You remember when the professional said there was electricity in the cosmos, but that it didn't do anything. Or when they said that charge separation could not be sustained in the cosmos because the charges would all rush together and neutralize. That's the cue for my perennial joke, sorry, people, about the Protestant who asked the Catholic, do you really believe in infant baptism? To which the Catholic replies, believe in it? I've seen it done. These professionals seem to have forgotten their own atom, with its electrons mysteriously separated from its protons, our pluralist, dynamic collective. In the beginning, there was charge separation, or more to my taste, here is a principle of being upon which all becoming follows. Charge separation is. Now that may not seem like much, it's not as though one hears an orchestral crescendo with timpani rolls, but there is a Copernican switch involved here. We abandon our descriptive and experiential prejudices, which are in favor of neutrality, equilibrium, and the three states in which we generally find matter as the standard by which we assess the rest, and we adopt the plasma standard and see the Earth with the eyes of the cosmos. I already mentioned Perrot's observation that conducting metal is like plasma. As he said, conventional definitions break down. Recall Gerald Pollack on water, and let me wave a hand at magnetohydrodynamics. And what were those things that we just heard about? I've forgotten this phrase now. Superconducting and southwestern geological formations. Everything acts like plasma, even solid rock on a comet. Did I mention hot gas? Perhaps all currents are Birkeland currents. Might there be a way forward there to understanding what is actually going on in a copper wire? Is it a conductor or an obstructor? It is said that plasma and the mathematics of plasma are messy, ugly. Perhaps it is time to educate our taste and discover grown-up mathematics. What the actual world gives us, scrubbed of wishful thinking, is charge separation, unstable equilibria, and fabulous discharges. Let us begin from this data and explain anomalous equilibria and transient neutrality. Perhaps you will better appreciate your freely gifted aphorism if we convert the proposition. It is not generally possible to convert propositions without risk of falsehood. But we are told that the universe is more than 99% plasma. And I would add that even at the frozen lattice-like heart of a crystal is the separation of charge. So I'm confident that this converse is true. Hello. I'm asking for more volume. Existence is charge separation. All the motion in the world follows. This principle is a claim about being, but generally in metaphysics, being and unity are hard to disentangle. As Euclid defined it, the unit is that by virtue of which each of the things that exist is called one. This claim, on the other hand, establishes a peculiar inwardly polarized separation as the fundamental principle of being. All becoming follows because it contains the seed of motion within itself. Or to put it more felicitously, Pantare. Everything flows. Let me close with the poetry of being, the poetry of plasma, and the poet of plasma physics, Empedocles of Acrogas. Pur kai hudor kai gaia, kai aeros apleton hypsos, kai taut allas santa diam peres udam alage, allo te men pilotatis in ercomen es hinapanta, allo te dau dice casta paraumena neceos ecte. Here I'll render it into the language of the new physics. Plasma, liquid, solid, and vapor, abundant on high, and this constant exchange never ends nor fades. Sometimes through attraction, everything comes together into one, but at other times, everything divides, born separate and apart, through repulsion's enmity. Thank you.